What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video. And this week, we're going to be taking a look at the standard, modern, and pioneer metagames and kind of making some assumptions of what is going to be happening over the next few months. Of course, we are getting ready to go into the standard RCQ season with Foundations being released, today as of the upload of this video. So we're going to take a look at the metagame as we kind of understand it now, and we're going to be kind of making some assumptions as to what Foundations could potentially do in the early parts of the format, and then we'll kind of revisit this video and see kind of what predictions we got right, what we got wrong, and kind of what has shaken out of the metagame. And of course, we're going to use this time to kind of explain why certain decks were kind of at the top of the metagame and maybe why people were playing certain different decks, and breaking down kind of the differences and why you would probably play certain versions over other decks. Of course, before we get too deep into the video and we dive into the standard metagame and make some predictions on the foundation set to the standard metagame, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me where we post mainly about the modern and pioneer format, but now delving into standard, as it is probably one of my favorite formats to play currently. So if any of that interests you, please consider subscribing and ring that notification bell so you know when videos get posted. It's a free, easy way to support me and my content. And of course, I'd like to take this time to thank the sponsor of the channel, Mana Traders. It is a subscription-based service where you can rent cards from Mana Traders onto Magic Online and be able to participate in some pretty bigger events like the Magic Online challenges and participate in leagues, as well as the free tournament series hosted by Mana Traders, where you can qualify for their December Invitational to win prizes. So if any of that interests you, please consider using the link in the description down below to sign up for Mana Traders, and you'll get 5% off your monthly subscription. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at the standard metagame and kind of explain what exactly we're looking at and how we're going to kind of approach and break it down, because I think we kind of have a good idea of what the metagame looks like at the tail end of the World Championship, and kind of using the World Championship to help us further understand exactly why we kind of see the things that we see. And then, of course, make those predictions for the foundation set. So let's go ahead and take a look at the standard metagame. So currently, this is how the standard metagame looks. We have Gruul Prowess, which when we kind of went over our worlds like introduction, our metagame breakdown, and making our predictions, we kind of thought Gruul Prowess was going to be the most played deck in that tournament, and it ended up being the most played deck. And post Worlds, where it only had a quarterfinals finish, it still looks like it's one of the top decks in the format at near 17%. Dimir Midrange, to me, was kind of the surprise, because I thought Golgari Midrange would kind of be the other deck to beat in the format. I thought it was pretty well positioned against the various aggro decks of the format. And turns out, I guess I'm not technically wrong, because it did make it to the finals, and there was like a variant of that Golgari Midrange deck, more or less playing the big up the beanstalks and things like that, but playing a lot of like the same removal package, just the creatures are a little bit tweaked. But, the traditional mid-range decks, even though it made it to the finals of the event, didn't really perform that well. Same thing with Gruul Prowess. But Dimir Midrange was a deck that kind of surprised me in a lot of ways. And Mono Red Prowess, of course, having a semifinals appearance and being undefeated in the Swiss up until that point, or just being undefeated and constructed up to that point in the semifinals of the World Championship. And of course, we see some other decks here. We have Azorius Tempo, which is kind of trying to get back an Abhorrent Oculus or a Haughty Djinn, and bring it back to the battlefield. Of course, accrue value that way, either by Abhorrent Oculus making a bunch of Manifest tokens, or I guess not even Manifest Dread. It's kind of the same thing. And or having a big Haughty Djinn to like come in and hit your opponent for a bunch of damage. Of course, we see Domain kind of adjusting to the metagame, Jeskai aggro, or like the Jeskai Convoke decks. The Temur Floodcaller combo deck, Orzhov midrange kind of seeing some play. But as we kind of see here, we have 10% plus of all the metagame decks here. Gruul Prowess, Dimir Midrange, Golgari Midrange, Mono Red Prowess, and then we kind of fall off a cliff at like over 5%. For Azorius Tempo. So these are kind of like the linchpins of the metagame here, and kind of the decks that we're going to be looking at as we transition into a foundation standard. So what exactly could it look like? These decks all have something in common with each other, or rather, like the aggro decks have something in common with each other, and then the mid-range decks have something in common. So we're going to start with Gruul Prowess here, and that's the first deck that we're going to end up looking at. So we're going to use Gruul Prowess as the example because it is the most played deck. Mono Red isn't nearly as popular, but they share a lot of the same characteristics to them, and there's obviously some benefits to playing more than one color, but in general, with how the mana bases are set up currently in Standard, it's better to be kind of like a two-color deck if you're going to end up playing it, because you don't want to end up stretching yourself too thin into multiple colors here. So we see Gruul Prowess, and a lot of the similarities that it shares between, Mono Red Prowess and Gruul Prowess is this, what we're going to call the mouse package. So we have Heartfire Hero. This is a card that, if you're familiar with my content, we've seen the Rakdos Prowess decks in Pioneer, maybe less so now because it just doesn't seem like it's a very popular archetype compared to some of the other things going on. But Heartfire Hero is kind of the linchpin of this mouse strategy. It's a 1-mana 1/1 that whenever it becomes a target of a spell or ability for the first time each turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. Then the ability has to be something you control. Your opponent can't target it with a removal spell, and then they get the trigger. And then when it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. So this is a card that can get out of hand very quickly and is kind of like the linchpin to these aggro strategies, because it's a creature that is going to get bigger over time. You're going to want to target it with various different spells. And then eventually it just goes kaboom if your opponent ever decides to kill it. And if they can't kill it, it's a creature that's going to be a 2/2 on turn 2, a 3/3 on turn 3, a 4/4 on turn 4, and in some cases going to have some combination of trample and double strike, which brings us to kind of our next creature in this mouse package, the Manifold Mouse. This is a card that some decks were kind of, whatever about, like Heartfire Hero, some pump spells, totally fine. And then turns out with the early iterations of Gruul Prowess, where we would see Innkeeper's Talent, and even here you actually see it kind of omitted from the main deck, and we see it kind of in the sideboard here. But a lot of the decks like playing Innkeeper's Talent, and I really enjoyed playing this because playing a Heartfire Hero on turn 1, Innkeeper's Talent on turn 2, you end up having a 3/3 mouse. It's going to be bigger than most of the things your opponent can play on turn 1. And then from there, you're able to play a 2-drop, maybe an Emberheart Challenger, level up the Innkeeper's Talent, and then put a counter on your Emberheart Challenger. You end up exiling a card. Hopefully it's another land or something. Who cares at that point? And then you're able to give ward 1 to both your creatures. Your Heartfire Hero is still going to be pretty big as a 3-power creature on turn 3, but then you're also going to have a 3-power Emberheart Challenger as well. So you definitely have some pretty neat ways, at least in the older versions, to where you could kind of constantly trigger it. But it turns out Manifold Mouse is a little bit better in doing it with, in combination with some other cards here. So Manifold Mouse is a 2-mana 1/2 that you can offspring for an additional 2. So you can pay up to 4 mana to get a 1/2 and a 1/1. That says the beginning combat on your turn, target creature or target mouse you control gains your choice of double strike or trampled on turn. Obviously, if you end up offspringing this, you can then end up making a creature or a mouse, have double strike and trample, or you can give 2 separate mice double strike, 2 separate trample, some combination, whatever. This allows you to then get repeated triggers off of your Emberheart Challenger and your Heartfire Hero to grow the Heartfire Hero or get some card advantage going with the Emberheart Challenger. Emberheart Challenger just gets absolutely massive too, and this is kind of the last mouse in our mouse package here, where 2-mana 2/2 Prowess Haste. This is already a good kind of stat line for a red creature. It's going to end up, you're going to end up playing other spells. You don't need to target it with things like Monstrous Rage or Might of the Meek, whatever the case may be. You're just going to able to, target your other things with it, target your Heartfire Hero, make it really big, and then your Emberheart Challenger is going to grow as a result of you playing all those spells. Kind of gives you an additional upside to playing some burn spells as well, as we see Shock and Lightning Strike here. Also kind of shared between the Gruul decks and now Mono Red. And then if you just happen to target it with some sort of effect, like again with Manifold Mouse or maybe even a Monstrous Rage to be able to kind of push through a bunch of damage, then you're going to be able to exile a top card of your library, and until end of turn you can play that card. And again, that's just kind of a way that you can get, essentially draw 2 cards a turn. You draw for your draw step, you end up getting something of the Emberheart Challenger. It's going to be really sweet there. So that's kind of the main draw, I would say, to playing the deck. Heartfire Hero just has the potential to output massive amounts of damage. Emberheart Challenger is going to get you some card advantage while also being able to pile on the damage for just playing your burn spells or playing some of your other pump spells. And Manifold Mouse is kind of the glue that kind of holds it together, where if you just play a Manifold Mouse on turn 2 after playing a Heartfire Hero, you're attacking with a 2/2 double striker, and from there you're just going to have an even bigger Heartfire Hero with the potential of just stacking on even more damage to it and potentially killing your opponent on turn 3 with certain draws. So definitely really neat there. Another similarity between like the Gruul decks and the mono red decks are the inclusion of Screaming Nemesis. Now, in the red decks, we see a card like the Frenzy, Witchstalker's Frenzy, which deals 5 damage to a target creature, and it costs 1 less for each creature that attacks. So with a card like Screaming Nemesis, that cares about being dealt damage and then dealing that much damage to another target, also having the added benefit if it deals damage to a player this way, then they can't gain life for the rest of the game. So you just hit your Screaming Nemesis with a Witchstalker Frenzy, and then you just absolutely ruin their day. So now that we kind of understand, like, the red package is absolutely insane. There's just a lot of aggressive potential that this deck ends up being able to carry out here. We have, again, the mouse package is absolutely insane. Screaming Nemesis is a fantastic card. Ends up actually doing a lot more work than I kind of gave it credit for when it was initially spoiled. Of course, I was thinking in terms of like Pioneer, really not thinking like its impact on Standard, but we even see cards like Screaming Nemesis, the mouse package, whatever, show up in Pioneer, and it seemed to be pretty effective there. So no reason to think that this also can't be that effective. So what are some advantages to playing like green, or even in some cases playing white? We've seen some of the white versions, or at least I've seen some of the white versions on Arena, where a lot of the time there's just a lot of really good auras that you can kind of pile onto these creatures, give them trample. Not only are they getting bigger from their abilities, but they're also getting bigger from the actual enchantments being played, with Ethereal Armor being reprinted, and basically just being able to kind of like run your opponent over in that way. So green is actually kind of taking a different approach here. So we see a card like Questing Druid. Really, you have this other half like called Seek the Beast, where you can exile top 2 cards of your library until the end of your next turn. You may play, or at the end of your next end step, you may play those cards, and then you can pay 2 mana to have a 1/1 that whenever you cast a white, blue, black, or red spell, you are able to put a +1/+1 counter on the Questing Druid, which again has like some synergy with cards like the Innkeeper's Talent, the sideboard, and kind of like why I like playing Innkeeper's Talent in the main deck over some of the other cards in here. But the Screaming Nemesis card, to kind of come back to it, has some additional synergy to it. And we know that from some of the other mid-range decks. We know that Archfiend of the Dross is a very popular card currently in the format. I mean, it's a 4-mana 6/6 that's going to absolutely take over the game, and something we're going to look at when we look at the 2 different mid-range decks in the format. But this card, Bushwhack, is actually kind of nuts. So you search for a basic land, reveal that card, put to your hand, then shuffle. Or you can have target creature you control fight target creature you don't control, which means that they're going to deal damage to each other, meaning that you could just have a Screaming Nemesis get in there, your opponent doesn't block with it, they take 3, and then you Bushwhack the Screaming Nemesis onto like their demon, and then you can end up hitting them for 6 damage, possibly even more depending on how big their creature is. So there's just kind of like a neat little synergy there. This also just works very well as like a good removal spell, especially when you have something like a Heartfire Hero. You're just able to like kind of crash your Heartfire Hero into something big after it's gotten a ton of damage, killing the Heartfire Hero, and then kind of throwing that damage at your opponent. There's just a lot of cool, like, neat little synergies that Bushwhack offers. Also playing green, you end up getting like Snakeskin Veil, which is able to, give a creature you control hexproof and put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. So making it slightly bigger. Definitely wants to be more defensive of a spell. It's not that great if you're just using it to pump through like damage or anything like that, because it's only going to get a +1/+1 counter on it, rather than something like Monstrous Rage, where it's going to get that permanent +1/+1 from the roll, but then also get that initial power boost, especially when you're targeting a double strike creature that just ends up being an insane amount of damage. But that's really kind of where, your green kind of comes up when we're only playing like 6 green spells in the main. A lot more on the sideboard definitely gives you some options there. And then, of course, like I said, the green is just kind of where you get your get some different ways of just kind of building up your deck. Playing mono red is definitely very effective. I personally enjoy playing the mono red version of the deck. I really like the synergy with like Witchstalker's Challenge, Witchstalker Frenzy, and Screaming Nemesis. But green here makes a pretty solid case when you have like Pick Your Poison, Snakeskin Veil, more Innkeeper's Talents, Paw Patch Formation just being a pretty good sideboard card, and we saw kind of like from the World Championship, and more Questing Druid just allow you to be a little bit more grindy and not necessarily in on like the curve 1, 2, 3, and then hope that your opponent is near dead, and then you can kind of figure it out from there. This does give you a little bit more staying power if you're in green. which I don't foresee end up, being very good, considering, I think white is just going to kind of take over thanks to some of the other cards, and we might actually see more burn-focused decks thanks to Boros Charm and Bolt Wave being printed in this new set, potentially alongside other kind of burn spells that we could see in future sets as well. I mean, just the fact that we have Shock, Lightning Strike, Boros Charm, and Bolt Wave in the format is pretty sick. And if we end up getting maybe another 3 damage burn spell, whether it's like at 1 or 2 mana, or we somehow get Skewer the Critics back, whatever the case may be, something in that capacity, it's going to be pretty interesting to see kind of how these red decks evolve. And I think that they have gotten a lot of support, maybe not necessarily from like the rares of Foundations, but definitely in the uncommon and common slots. They are definitely looking pretty good there. We see Viashino Pyromancer, and we see of course, the name of it I can't remember off the top of my head, because why would I be able to do that? There's just a lot of good small creatures that are low to the ground that you can play, where you don't necessarily have to play this mouse package, where you're kind of a little bit more incentivized to play things like Might of the Meek or Monstrous Rage to kind of like trigger these things if you don't have Manifold Mouse. And you can focus more on like a bird strategy, and you can play more creatures like Monastery Swiftspear and Gitu Lava Runner, which is a card I failed to think of earlier but now remembered. You can play those kind of cards, and then they'll just be in general a lot better on their own when you're playing things like Bolt Wave and the Boros Charms and things like that. So I definitely think that red decks are in a very good place. I don't see them kind of falling off like too hard, if at all. Just again, for the fact that they're already kind of like the best deck in the format. To me, they're the most fun to play. I think aggro decks in general in the early parts of metagames are just a very good option to kind of gravitate towards. Even though we're not necessarily having like rotation or anything like that, and the format is still pretty massive. I kind of like when people are playing and experimenting with different things, that if you're just looking to kind of get people while they're maybe trying to like fine tune and tweak things, or they think they kind of have it figured out and then they don't necessarily have it figured out, that it's just pretty easy to play an aggro deck, because I think it's hard a lot of the times to screw up playing an aggro deck, especially when your opponent's stumbling. Like, as long as you have like some pretty good like technical play, like you're always going to be able to like win games with like a bad aggro deck versus winning games with like a bad mid-range deck or like a bad control deck. So I kind of expect Grow Prowess and mono red to be kind of like business as usual, and just like the red aggro based strategies kind of be business as usual. And it's going to be more fine-tuning like how many of like the really good cards do we want to play versus potentially playing some bad cards in the deck, which I mean Boros Charm might even be like one of the worst cards. And when we have something like Slick Shot Show Off just been kind of waiting in the wings, no pun intended there, because it's a bird wizard, that it could benefit the most from something like a Boros Charm as well. So definitely some interesting things to kind of look at there, but that's kind of where we stand with the aggro decks of the format. Now let's kind of turn our attention to the mid-range decks, because obviously like Prowess and these like mono red creatures are not infallible. They're not absolutely broken, busted to where you can't ever beat like the aggro deck. So let's kind of check and see what these like black base mid-range decks are doing, and we'll kind of look at the difference of how Dimir mid-range and Golgari mid-range are kind of attacking the metagame from there. So we're going to start with Golgari mid-range. I think this is probably even though the metagame suggests that the Dimir version is more popular, I think Golgari is probably a little bit more recognizable than what's going on in the blue version. Plus, they kind of attack the metagame with that second color in 2 different ways, but really where they kind of share a lot of similarities is in the removal package, or kind of like the black spells that they choose to play in the deck. A lot of the time kind of going towards cards like Cut Down, Anoint with Affliction, and Go for the Throat. Cut Down is an amazing 1-mana removal spell. Destroy target creature with total power toughness 5 or less. So a lot of the red creatures, outside of something like a Heartfire Hero that's kind of gotten a few counters on it already, which Cut Down is going to have kind of diminishing returns like the later you go into a game anyway. Screaming Nemesis also just naturally by its size getting around Cut Down. You can kill a lot of things with a Cut Down. The worst thing about Cut Down is the fact that you can kind of get blown out by it. So you destroy, you target, say, a Heartfire Hero that has +1/+1 counter on, so it's a 2/2, and it hasn't been targeted by anything yet, and your opponent ends up casting a Monstrous Rage. And, essentially for 2 reasons. Now, Cut Down is not going to be very effective, because the The Monstrous Rage is going to be able to, with the power buff, along with the enchantment, and of course the +1/+1 counter that the Heartfire hero is going to get from being targeted, it's going to nullify, cut down. It's going to see that it doesn't have total power, toughness 5 or less, so it's not going to kill it. So that part sucks. And then future cut downs will not kill that same Heartfire hero, thanks to the +1/+1 counter, even if something happens to that. The roll token that is given to it, you're still not going to be able to kill it with a cut down. So definitely for any advice for people that are playing with the card cut down against like these red strategies, you're better off just using cut down as soon as possible, whether your opponent taps out for Heartfire hero on turn 1. Turn 2, I can see just kind of using cut down right then and there, or even like waiting until your opponent does something with the Heartfire hero, maybe catch them kind of lacking, if you will, by trying to go for maybe a little bit more aggressive of a Monstrous Rage, to where you can kind of kill the creature. You end up getting that spell out of their hand. They don't get the counter, and you still only take 1 from the Heartfire hero. So just something to remember with cut down. Like, this is a very good removal spell, but with pump spells currently, at least by the end of the season, being pretty popular, versus, maybe we potentially see a lot more burn spells, and we really don't see this package. Cut down is going to only get, I would imagine, probably get better as we kind of get to the release of Foundations, and maybe some of the red decks kind of tweak around with like what creatures they want to play, and by turn, like what spells they want to kind of support those creatures. Anoint with Affliction, exile target creature if its mana value 3 or less. This is absolutely awesome. It does have an extra bit of text where if if its controller has 3 or more poison counters on it, then you just exile a creature instead. So yeah. So with Anoint with Affliction, this is able to get around the death trigger of the Heartfire hero, which again is so important for these red decks to kind of get going and able to kind of eke out just even that much more damage. So Anoint with Affliction also getting to hit creatures mana value 3 or less. It's going to end up getting all of the creatures in the red strategies and a lot of the other smaller creatures and some of the other decks as well. Anoint with Affliction is just a very good inclusion for these decks. Finally, you have Go for the Throat. Destroy target non-artifact creature. There's not really any non-artifact creature, or rather artifact creatures, that are kind of running around the format. So Go for the Throat a lot of the time just ends up getting to be just 2 mana destroy target creature a lot of the time. And again, with a lot of the Dimir strategies and even the Golgari strategies, kind of focusing on some of these big creatures, like a lot of the demon packages and stuff that we see, thanks to cards like Unholy Annex / Ritual Chamber and Archfiend of the Dross. Like the Go for the Throat, just being able to kill those creatures is absolutely huge for a lot of the format, excuse me. So these are just kind of like the holy trinity, if you will, of removal spells, where they answer a lot of the stuff that's going on with the aggro decks early on, and then of course use kind of the other colors to further their advantage to kind of make it even harder for those red aggro decks to kind of get a hold back on the game. Because even if you kind of like knock them out of it, especially the Gruul decks are a little bit grindier, they're going to be able to get a little bit of card advantage going, so they're able to kind of prop themselves up and put themselves back in a position to try and win the game. So how do we kind of prevent this sort of thing from happening? So if you're playing against the aggro deck and you're like the Golgari deck, Glissa, Sunslayer is absolutely insane. First Strike, Death Touch a lot of the time is going to end up winning a lot of the time. Of course, they have the ability to give their mice double strike, at some point. So a lot of the time too, like Glissa could just end up trading for those sort of things. But nonetheless, like Glissa is absolutely insane against the creatures that are not double striking, and you're just going to be able to kind of knock them out pretty early on. I think a little bit worse against like the Heartfire heroes, because again, Heartfire hero wants to die. Especially if it's also one of those creatures that's double strike, because it tramples over for a little bit and then it just deals massive amounts of damage to you. And of course, like Screaming Nemesis as well, just dealing first strike damage to it. It's going to die, but then it's going to be able to deal 3 damage to the Glissa, ultimately killing it or going at your face and stopping stuff like your 1-of Tranquil Frill back from getting life. But, again, ideally for these red decks, or excuse me, for the mid-range decks, they're leaning heavily on kind of like the black cards of the deck with the cut down, Anoint with Affliction, Go for the Throat. On the early turns of the game, to where you kind of get to that turn 4, you play an Archfiend of the Dross. It's going to be a lot bigger than everything that your opponent's going to play, and as long as you keep the board clear, short of a Screaming Nemesis, Archfiend of the Dross is going to kind of slowly take over the game. You're going to be able to turn the corner, kind of attack with it, and then use your mana to, say, end up getting like a Trinkle Frill back to gain some life, and of course I go target plays graveyard, kind of like whatever, but or even just be able to play this, gain 4 life, and then leave up something like a cut down or use a duress to kind of get a potential monstrous rage, shock, or lightning strike out of your opponent's hand. There's a few different ways that this deck can kind of go about it. And of course, if you're playing against some of the other mid-range decks, Mosswood Dread Knight gets you a lot of good card advantage. You know, just 2 mana, draw a card, lose a life, who cares? And then this is like an annoying threat, 3 powers a lot, saddling Caustic Bronco to be able to potentially flip over something like an Unholy Annex and, you know, just dome your opponent for 8 off a Caustic Bronco attack, giving you card advantage. You know, there's just a lot to like from what these Golgari mid-range decks are doing, and that's kind of what the green offers. You know, Tranquil Throwback, again, to kind of gain some life here. We see Glista Sunslayer is a really good creature, also having some ends up being really good against like an Archfiend of the Dross on the other side of the board, because if Archfiend of the Dross doesn't block Sunslayer, or this ends up getting through for whatever reason, you just remove a bunch of counters from Archfiend of the Dross and your opponent ends up losing the game. You know, we're all good here. Mosswood Dread Knight, again, getting you kind of the card advantage, and of course some of the other cards on the sideboard as well, with another Tranquil Frillback, Terror Sunder, and I believe like Choking Miasma as well, just having a kicker cost on it to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, and then, you know, giving a bunch of creatures -2/2, allowing some of your smaller early creatures to kind of live a Choking Miasma, which is again like really good against like the red base decks. Of course, we see more Annoyance with Affliction, Shielder's Edict, we have one here as well, and that's kind of where you want to be in terms of the mid-range deck. So that's kind of like the way green is approaching the matchup. We're going to take a look at the blue real quick, and then we'll kind of make a general assumption of like what kind of these mid-range decks end up gaining post foundations. So finally, with the Dimir versions of these kind of mid-range decks, they of course are playing the same kind of removal package that we had seen. Cut down, Annoy with Affliction, although 1 copy instead of 2, and then Forgo for the Throw. Again, these are just some really good cards to kind of play and make sure that you don't get punked out by your aggro opponent on the very early turns of the game. We see Gix's Command in the main here. The big thing being that like destroy each creature with power 2 or less, so you can kind of get to a point where your opponent's just kind of like having to play out their creatures, not really much more they can do, kind of again their second win. Gix's Command can, you know, just put them all away, or you can use this as like a really good kind of really a grindier option in kind of the late game against some other mid-range decks. The fact that you'll be able to kind of return up to 2 target creatures from your graveyard to your hand and make them sacrifice a creature of their highest power, more than likely going to be something like a Chancellor or an Archfiend of the Dross, not Chancellor. That's a completely different card. But you know, again, that's kind of where the black kind of stands out, where it's probably one of the best, you know, colors in terms of removal and even threats as well. So what exactly is the blue used for? Why aren't we just playing just mono black, kind of like how the Gruul aggro decks are kind of split between playing green or just being straight up red? Well, the reason for playing blue here, you get access to cards like Fairy Mastermind, with a card like Unholy Annex being very popular. Fairy Mastermind can easily just end up drawing you an additional card, while your opponent is also drawing additional cards, allow you to keep up. This being a flash threat, along with a lot of the other cheap flying threats like Spyglass Siren, which is for whatever reason a really hard name for me to say. Deep Cavern Bat, it's going to be able to disrupt what your opponent has going on, plus kind of be a lightning rod for removal spells. Like if you take a card that your opponent really wants, they're going to point like a shock or a lightning strike or a cut down or Anoint with Affliction, something of that nature at the Deep Cavern Vat, which is a lot better than something like a Fairy Mastermind, Preacher of the Schism, or Enduring Curiosity, which is also why you kind of play some of these other, you know, small like flying threats, because Enduring Curiosity is going to allow you to draw a card whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player. This isn't just one or more creatures, so you are able to, you know, if you connect with a Spyglass Siren, Deep Cavern Bat, and a Fairy Mastermind, you're going to be able to draw 3 cards, you know, if they all, assuming that they all connect to your opponent. This is kind of reminiscent of the Esper mid-range decks that we kind of saw before rotation, I believe even at the Pro Tour from the previous season, where, you know, you're going to attack with a bunch of like small, cheap creatures that are going to be very disruptive. You're going to end up being able to potentially load a bunch of counters on it, or just kind of, you know, turn the 2 or 3 cards in your hand into relevant spells with a bunch of mana on the board, and you're going to be able to kind of interact with your opponent. This is just giving you straight up raw card advantage at the cost of maybe a little bit of extra power here and there, because you're not technically conniving with these, you're just drawing the card straight up. Again, if your opponent has a Fairy Mastermind on the other side, kind of rough, but with you having a Fairy Mastermind as well, you know, this gives you like a mana sink plus just a really good flash threat to kind of attack and hit your opponent for a decent amount of damage. Because chunking them for like 3, 4, 5 in the air every turn is going to end the game very quickly. And Enduring Curiosity itself having flash and then also being pretty annoying to deal with, because even if it dies, if it's a creature, it just returns to the battlefield under your control as an enchantment, meaning it can't be targeted by any of the removal spells. It dodges something like Annoying with Affliction, so it doesn't even get exiled by the Enduring Curiosity, unless, for whatever reason your opponent is able to give you poison counters, then it'll work. But this card is just really powerful. And on top of that too, Sheoldred is still pretty good in this format, being 5 toughness. Obviously doesn't dodge like Witchstalker Frenzy, but you are able to kind of put your opponent in some very awkward positions to where, they have to be able to have a 5 power, like double striking thing from the aggro side or something of that nature to be able to beat the Sheoldred. Like, this is still just a really good card. On top of that, like the synergy with Enduring Curiosity, where you kind of like flashes it on turn 4, untap, slam a Sheoldred, attack with 4 flyers, and then all of a sudden you draw 4 cards, you gain 8 life with Sheoldred. That's a lot of life to gain, even against someone who's playing like double striking Emberheart Challengers and Heartfire Heroes. That's still a lot of damage to kind of overcome without having something like a Burn Together to, hit your opponent for like 16 with a Heartfire Hero and then throw it at your opponent, and then also get the Burn Together burn plus the damage from like the Heartfire Hero. You just need to be able to do a lot of damage when Sheoldred is able to gain you like 10, 12 life a turn with what you have, plus just putting a major clock on your opponent as well. Lastly here, of course, aside from some of the sideboard cards, we have Kaito, Bane of Nightmares, which has been a pretty good card. You get to double up on things like Deep Cavern Bat, where you kind of don't care the cards underneath of it. Hit your opponent, you end up returning it, putting the Kaito into play. You end up giving your opponent the card back, but then sometimes you're just going to be able to cast the Deep Cavern Bat again, be able to take that either that card or just get a fresh look at your opponent's hand. Protecting Fairy Masterminds, Siren Spyglass is probably the best one to get back, just from the fact that you create a map token. Then you're able to kind of get a little bit of card selection there in a way where you're either going to put the land into your hand, ensuring that you hit your land drop, or find some of these other spells that are going to kind of get you across the finish line here. Towards the sideboard here, we used to look at some other counter spells as like kind of ways to attack what your opponent is doing. Tishana's Tidebinder as well, just being able to kind of probably mess with Unholy Annex more than anything. Just when they trigger it on their end step to draw an extra card, just like boom, get rid of it. Target up to 1 target activated or triggered ability. Yeah, if the ability is an artifact, creature, or planeswalker. Oh, actually, it doesn't even work for that. Huh. That's actually interesting that Tidebinder has that kind of... We're learning it live, ladies and gentlemen. I guess you can do this for like a Sheoldred too. But, your blue is definitely going to be more towards like counter spells. It's definitely going to hurt the more burn-focused strategies, I would say. With cards like 3 Steps Ahead, you're able to kind of draw 2 cards, discard a card at instant speed. You're able to just counter a spell straight up, or create a token as a copy of target artifact or creature you control, doubling up on Enduring Curiosities, more Preacher of the Schisms, Fairy Masterminds, Deep Cavern Bats, whatever. Like, there's a lot of good creatures that you can kind of copy on your turn at your opponent's end step that you're going to end up getting a good amount of value from as a whole, and just be able to kind of continue to put pressure on your opponent, being able to kind of take out their threats and have the card advantage to kind of keep up with them, kind of going wide and eventually just kind of grinding them into a fine dust. Now, which version between Dimir and Golgari is better? Personally, watching the games kind of play out, I really like the Dimir deck a lot. Just the fact of, to me, kind of giving me some like early 2010 vibes of like Theros Standard, where we'd see like Biden Thassa and a bunch of like small blue creatures end up getting in. You end up drawing 3 or 4 cards. So I really kind of like that feeling of Dimir midrange, plus a lot, again, having access to the really good removal, plus some creatures that maybe on their own aren't really all that exciting versus something from like the Golgari deck. But definitely with how they all synergize together and how they can end up kind of taking over the game and kind of serving their purpose is something that I really like. So, I mean, personally for me, I like Dimir midrange, and that's a deck that I would kind of look towards, probably shifting to more towards a control deck here, where maybe you could see Enduring Curiosity in some of these more aggressive versions, but then you may see like control versions that are playing like the Sphinx of Forgotten Lore, where we could potentially see more cards just kind of being flashback and a more of an emphasis on cantrips and potentially like copying creatures as kind of more aggressively, I suppose, or more proactively than we do reactively. So that's kind of like my analysis of the standard metagame. Of course, there's a lot of other decks that are being played in the format. Of course, we saw that the blue-white Oculus decks are still kind of running around, not nearly as much as a lot of these other decks, but I think this kind of gives you a good idea of if you're kind of brewing for the format, these are the decks that you kind of look at and try to beat when you're trying to build your deck. Or if you're playing any one of the 4 aforementioned decks, then you need to have kind of an idea of how you're going to attack one another and kind of where your role is and sort of those positions, things like that. So that's really it, at least for the current standard metagame. What can we expect from Foundations going forward? And this is kind of all on my little monologue here. So I think a lot of predictions for it. I think that aggro is just already going to be really good. I mean, it's obviously fantastic right now, and it's only gotten a lot better pieces. I think some of the mid-range decks, you can argue some of the other colors kind of got a boost to what's going on. I think Elenda of Dusk Saint is absolutely amazing against all the other Dimir mid-range decks because a lot of their removal spells don't actually deal with the Elenda. You kind of have to go pretty deep. We've seen some decks playing Scorching Shot in like the red decks where sorcery, you can technically kill Elenda, but again, doesn't do a really good job of it's like so far down the list. Like it's played like 1 or 2 copies in like the 75 of like some other decks, and like sometimes it's not even played at 2 copies, So I think that's a card where we can kind of see Orzhov mid-range maybe kind of jump up a little bit in the rankings there. I expect kind of there to be some like combo black decks. Of course, we see the Unstoppable Slasher and the whatever demon from like the Lost Caverns of Ixalan set where you can kind of one-shot your opponent there. Of course, we have Bloodthirsty Conqueror and like Enduring Tenacity, or one of the other cards that was printed in Foundations to where you can essentially just drain your opponent of all their life. Of course, just that card also, like Bloodthirsty Conqueror, just being a very good card when you want to play something like Elenda, or just kind of like play one of these strategies where you're going to kind of nickel and dime your opponent. You're going to end up gaining a bunch of life and making their life very, very difficult there. I think there's a lot of like really good, impactful mythic rares that we've kind of seen. We kind of talked about in shorts, as well as a lot of the commons and uncommons that are going to be sticking around standard for 5 years. So I think it's honestly pretty boring what we expect to see. I think the red decks are going to be tooling around with, what makes their red deck the best deck. And exactly if being more burn focused, or maybe just kind of going back to the well and having like this mouse package plus the pump spells is going to be a lot better than having things like consistent damage, kind of like Bolt Wave and like Boros Charm, where players are maybe kind of gravitating more towards playing like negates and different sort of like counter spells, something like the where we even see with like Phantom Interference, like 2 mana counter spell unless they pay 2, ends up being just a very good cheap counter spell. Especially when you're kind of on the draw and you're just hoping to hit your land drops and then kind of find where you can play your creatures and slowly put pressure on your opponent there. So we'll kind of see. I think the metagame shifts more towards playing counter spells, like I said, Phantom Interference 3 steps ahead, negates, things like that, or maybe even playing duresses. We could see decks kind of shift more towards like the creature heavy builds, and then we just see things like Monstrous Rage still, or maybe some of the other burn spells just to double up as kind of like removal. Or if we see kind of a more removal heavy like situation kind of going on, is again, this is where I kind of lean more towards Dimir than I do the Golgari decks, where if people are just playing a bunch of removal, maybe they're not so counterspell heavy, then we could just see a lot of like really good creatures early on that are going to get in a ton of damage while you're casting some of your spells, and then while your opponent's kind of stuck with their removal in hand, you're going to be able to like Boros Charm, Bolt Wave, Shock, and Lightning Strike their face until they end up dying. And since they took like 4, 5, 6 damage from like your early creatures, that they end up kind of going down to kind of things like that. But I think ultimately we're going to see a pretty big shakeup in the standard metagame. I think that this is a pretty decent sized set with a lot of really good cards that all have the potential to see play. We see some other typal strategies. I think elves and goblins are kind of the ones that players reach to first. Angels has a lot of really good support. I mean, they basically get to play a lot of the same things that they play in a Pioneer. Currently still legal in a standard again. And I mean, with the addition of the not Baneslayer Angel, Lyra Dawnbringer, just being like a good way, like a good lord that is going to give your angels some extra buffs on top of Giada also giving them. So there's a lot of good like typal strategies. There's a lot of good commons and uncommons that just in general are going to see play. There's a lot of good rares and mythic rares I could see slotting their way into some already established decks, or just kind of spinning off and creating their own thing. And that's probably the most boring answer I could probably give for something like this. But in general, I think that's just kind of how we are and where we're at when kind of like operating this metagame and making predictions, is that the good cards are going to good and the bad cards are going to bad. And we kind of have to sort through all the junk to see what happens. And that's why we're going to revisit this, in the coming weeks. I kind of expect the aggro strategies to kind of shift more towards a burn focused strategy, trying to figure out exactly how good that is. And I think in a few weeks we'll kind of get a good understanding. I don't know. There could just potentially be a very good mix of creature based aggro versus like burn based aggro, but I think we're going to see a lot of heavy burn decks early on. Basically just trying to live with the cope that burn is not very good in Modern currently. And so that's the standard metagame. That's my predictions for Foundations on the standard metagame, and ended up going a lot deeper and a lot longer than I thought I would. So if you made it to the end, I applaud you, because that was probably just a lot of incoherent rambling that probably most humans wouldn't understanding. So, but I do appreciate the support. Thank you all so much for watching. If you did enjoy, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below what you're excited for out of Foundations and what you're looking forward to in Standard. Of course, subscribe to the channel, all that fun stuff. Check out the sponsor of the channel, all those great and happy things. And that's gonna do it for me. Hope you all enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you all in the next one.